Pacific. Well, actually just the Asia Pacific, but there's a focus on Japan, so well, I think because it's the economics of Japan, but this might be more general. So let's discover that for ourselves, shall we? Chapter 8. From Unipolarity to Multipolarity, 1991 to 2010. Oh boy, let's get ready for this. The new structure of international relations and the Asia Pacific. The sudden and total unexpected disintegration of the Soviet Union brought to an abrupt end a bipolar system that had spanned the world for the previous 4 decades. It was one characterized not only by a strategic conflict between the two superpowers and the balance of nuclear power, but also by a clash between two distinct ideological, political, and economic systems. At a stroke, the old world order disappeared to be replaced by uncertainty as to how best to understand a new era of international politics. With the removal of the worldwide divisions of the Cold War system, and with the recognition that Soviet-style socialist economics were not a viable alternative to the market-based international economy, all the barriers to the worldwide spread of capitalism disappeared. This left the United States as the sole superpower to enjoy what was called its unipolar moment. The spread of globalization and the attendant rapid economic changes were to see the center of gravity of the international political economy shift decisively from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The main beneficiary of globalization was China, despite, or as its rulers claim, because of the continued rule of the Communist Party. China rose from being primarily regional great power into becoming a global actor. Not only did it become the world's leading manufacturer, but it also became a major economic player in the Middle East, Africa, and South America. China's rise, however, has also been accompanied by the rise of others, such as India and Brazil, and a resurgent Russia, while Japan remains an important player. Although the United States still remains the only truly global power, with an economy accounting for nearly 25% of the world's GNP. GNP is like the gross national product. It's how much goods a country produces. first of China and Russia, the significance of Central Asia became a new factor in the region. Russia itself, as the successor in many respects to the Soviet Union, at first almost ceased to be a major player, but as it has since re-established a degree of domestic political order and coherence, it has once again sought to become a significant player. The rise of India has introduced this major power into the region as a player of growing economic and strategic influence beyond its traditional confinement to South Asia. But Afghanistan and Pakistan are still excluded from the region, notwithstanding the pervasiveness of the American-led war on terror, or India's ongoing deep-rooted conflict with Pakistan, centering on Kashmir, and China's all-weather friendship with that country. One indication of the difference between the claims of India and the other two to membership of the Asia-Pacific region is that India is a member of most of the region's institutions, while Pakistan and Afghanistan are not. The United States remained as the sole superpower, but despite its apparent dominance, the United States was unable to reshape the world in accordance with its vision of free markets and democratization. For example, the American attempt to persuade China to improve its practice of human rights by using trade as a lever failed miserably in 1994 after a year of trying. Similarly, the American-led attempts to address the problems of civil wars and the breakdowns of order within states through a humanitarian intervention, as displayed in the Balkans, did not prove successful in Somalia. Following the declaration of war on terror after 9/11 in 2001, the U.S. launched a war against the Taliban in Afghanistan and then another in Iraq, which had yet to show signs of imminent conclusion at the time of writing in July 2010. These two hugely costly wars have constrained the U.S. strategically and contributed to the nation's indebtedness. The United States has also failed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, first to India and Pakistan, then to North Korea, and possibly Iran. That's rough. Failed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. That's kind of scary. When combined with the impact of the gravest financial crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s, the perception grew in much of the world, including at home, that the United States was in relative decline. The turning point was 9/11, less because of the impact of the terrorist act itself, huge though that was, than because of the reaction of the Bush administration in launching two long wars and pursuing economic policies that culminated in the great financial crisis of 2008. By the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the United States may still have remained the world's sole superpower, but its so-called hegemony was being successfully challenged by the combined effect of the rise of the independent power of China and, to a lesser extent, India, Brazil, and a resurgent Russia. Even though a little could be done on a global scale without American leadership, America could no longer act unilaterally. It had to act multilaterally, or perhaps more accurately, in partnership with others. These poles, or other centers of power or global significance, which also included the European Union and Japan, differed markedly in their characteristics and capabilities, and were by no means in alignment together to balance American power. Rather, they were separate constellations of power, some seen as rising, notably China, India, and Brazil, while others were perceived by comparison as stagnating. such was their respective weight in world affairs that collectively they ended up constraining the US from being able to act successfully on its own. These powers both cooperated and competed with each other, and each still found its relationship with the United States to be more important than any other relationship. Yet the United States and its Western partners, who hitherto had dominated the international economy, found that they could not properly address the problems which arose from the American-created financial crisis of 2008 in the previous manner through their group of 7 or 8. The previous formed group of 20 dramatically came into its own as this much larger gathering, which included the rising powers, met in Pittsburgh and London in 2009 to agree on measures to manage the crisis. The United States found that it could not necessarily get its own way. The same was true of the Copenhagen meeting in December 2009 to deal with climate change. It was globalization and the adoption of appropriate economic and trade policies that enabled China and India to rise. In this sense, globalization was principally an economic phenomenon, but globalization also facilitated the revolution in communications associated with computers and other forms of telecommunications. On the downside, however, globalization also facilitated the growth and expansion of transnational terrorism, crime, communicable, reading is hard, diseases, illegal migration, and money laundering, and it intensified the impact on the international community of the dangers posed by failed states. These so-called non-traditional security concerns threatened the well-being of national societies and called for more cooperative means of dealing with them, as traditional security worries were still evident in parts of the world, notably in Asia. Although the new non-traditional security problems were global in scope, they could only be addressed through the actions of states. Globalization, therefore, was paradoxical in its effects upon states. On the one hand, the process penalized economically those states that preferred to close their doors to the international economy, or who refused to adapt their commercial laws and practices to those which prevailed in the new globalized world, such as North Korea and Myanmar, Burma. Therefore, it was argued that the process of globalization eroded the capacity of states to determine their own socio-economic preferences. On the other hand, however, many aspects of globalization, especially in the non-traditional security areas, required the presence of strong domestic state institutions if these new issue areas were to be properly addressed. Effective state institutions were required even in the economic sphere if markets were to be properly regulated and laws duly enforced. The paradox was even greater with regard to the truly global problem of climate change, where all were agreed that the common action was needed, but where in practice state interest in the end predominated, as was evident at the Copenhagen Conference of December 2009. The end of bipolarity, whatever, also opened the way to the further development of regionalism and regional institutions. In Europe, this entailed both the deepening and the widening of the European Union, and in East Asia it led to the formulation of new concepts of regionalism and the proliferation of regional institutions and meetings. These largely grew out of the extension of the scope of the Southeast Asian nations, the ASEAN, or ASEAN, yes, which was the only regional body to have been formed exclusively by Asian states during the Cold War period. Its institutional practice, known as the ASEAN, ASEAN way, put the emphasis on informality, consensus, non-interference, and voluntarism, meaning the unenforceability of resolutions. In that sense, it was more limited than the main regional institutions of Africa or America, let alone of Europe. Perhaps it was precisely its relatively loose character that enabled the new institutions it inspired, such as APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, founded in 1989, and the ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum, founded in 1994 to advance cooperative security, to include China within the ranks and help incorporate the giant country within the patterns of regional diplomacy. Another product of the end of the Cold War was that the states found that their room for maneuvers, both at home and abroad, had increased, as they were no longer subject to the discipline of what might be called the axis of conflict imposed upon them by the conflict between the two superpowers. That had an impact on how people thought about the nature of governance at home and about the external roles of their countries. Great and medium powers especially found that they had to reconfigure their identities anew. This was true of such diverse powers as China, India, and Japan. In China, this occasioned the replacement of socialism by nationalism as the main instrument for appealing to the people. India, bereft of the Soviet support, threw off its semi-socialistic economic system for a more market-led approach. In the case of Japan, the end of the Cold War brought about an end to the so-called San Francisco system. These developments were related to their repositioning of themselves in international affairs. More generally, because the regional security alliances, the so-called hub and spoke system centering on the U.S., no longer had an external enemy. They had to be re-examined and reformulated to meet new and unprecedented circumstances. The looseness of the international system in comparison to the more rigid bipolar character of the Cold War system allowed for greater latitude for domestic politics to shape the foreign policies of state. That in turn contributed to the looseness and uncertainties of the post-Cold War era. The economic dimensions of international politics acquired great salience in Asia, in part because of the growing significance of economic globalization, and in part because of the importance of national economic performance to the popularity of governments and the legitimacy of their political systems. A small intermission to quickly sip some coffee, because this is quite some dense stuff. expansion of NATO and the widening of the European Union to embrace virtually all the European states up to the borders of Russia. The end of the Cold War in Europe led to a fundamental and systematic transformation as democracy and the market replaced communist rule and the command economy throughout the half of Europe, formerly dominated by the Soviet Union. In marked contrast to the situation in Europe, the end of communist rule in Asia Pacific did not simultaneously accompany the end of the bipolarity. China, Vietnam, and North Korea continued to be ruled by communist parties. Perhaps this was because of the strong nationalist roots of these parties, and unlike the Mongolian People's Republic, the only other country in Asia ruled by a communist party, none was a satellite of the Soviet Union. They survived the effective demise of communism as an ideology and as an alternative to capitalist economics. As a result, a residual flavor, if not the substance of Cold War politics, remained in the region. Thus, notwithstanding China's adoption of a more market-oriented economy and its growing integration into the capitalist international economy, Sino-American relations were still heavily shaped by the differences between the respective political systems. Particularly in the view of the end of Communist Party rule in Eastern Europe later that year, 1989 brought that Sino-American difference into sharp focus, as the Tiananmen massacre of the 4th of June was remembered in the U.S. as signifying all that was wrong with a regime that was willing to shoot peaceful demonstrators, whereas China's communist leaders remembered it as an occasion in which they saved the country from chaos, even as the Americans allegedly sought to change their system by an insidious process of peaceful evolution. Ah yes, so insidious. In their view, the systemic collapse of communism in Europe was caused in part by the application of that policy by the U.S. Even the ostensibility friendly policy towards China, known as engagement, that was adopted by the Clinton administration later in the 1990s, included the objective of seeking to encourage the eventual development of pluralistic democratic politics in China. In East Asia, the immediate political changes brought about by the end of the Cold War were essentially power-related consequences of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The purpose of America's military alliances in the region was no longer as clear-cut. The strategic rationale that had brought China and the United States together in opposition to the Soviet Union was no more. China itself was freed from the threat, albeit a declining one, of attack from the north and enjoyed new strategic latitude. Those conflicts in Asia whose prosecution depended entirely upon the Soviet Union, Afghanistan and Cambodia, were settled as Soviet support came to an end, but other local conflicts stemming from the Cold War, notably those of Korea and Taiwan, remained in place, although century, American superiority extended well beyond the military sphere and advanced technology on which it rested. American preeminence also stemmed from its economic strength, in which its GNP alone accounted for over 25% of the world's total. The United States was the major market for all the important economic centers such as Europe and East Asia. It attracted the most foreign direct investment, FDI, and its currency was the most important one of all international transactions. It was the leading center for international finance, and it dominated the world's key international economic organizations, including the IMF and the World Bank. In short, it was the economy of the United States that drove the other economies forward. In the terms of Susan Strange, the United States dominated the force structure of power: military, financial, trade, and knowledge. American preeminence also drew strength from what Joseph Nye had called its soft power, that is to say, from its capacity to influence others and shape their agendas as a result of the spread of its culture through mass media and the appeal of its political and economic systems. By the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, the significance of American power had weakened in many respects. The 2 long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had taken their toll on the U.S. military and had substantially increased American indebtedness. Combined with the impact of the financial crisis of 2008, the United States was seen both at home and abroad to be facing several years of struggle to recover from its recession and to 2 wars. Yet America remained as the only provider of the economic, trade, and security public goods in the East Asia in the Asia Pacific. In effect, the U.S. continued to underwrite the basis on which the East Asian states, notably China, were able to pursue economic development and rapid growth as their primary goal. In addition, America provided a principal market for East Asian exports. Protected the global lines of communication and transport, and remained the cornerstone of the international institutions which undergirded, that's a fun word, the international economy. To be sure, the United States was no longer able to do so alone. But even in a more multilateral context, American leadership and capabilities were vital if the new challenges to the international system were to be met. Bereft of the clear axis of conflict provided by the confrontation between the 2 camps, the United States found that it lacked a unifying theme to guide its overall strategy toward the different parts of the world together, or to provide coherence for the foreign policy of the world's preeminent power. Theorists of the political international economy had long argued that a system dominated by a hegemon was one that would enjoy stability. In practice, however, neither the administrations of Clinton nor Bush provided that kind of hegemonic stability. Well, that sucks. The former encouraged globalization and expansion of democracy in the market, but it did not do so consistently. It provided uncertain leadership in the development of the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, and it did not provide a coherent strategic doctrine that sought to explain where, when, and for what purposes the administration would use the overwhelming power at its disposal. The administration of Bush the Younger began with the intention of developing a coherent new strategic approach that took account of the changes at the end of the Cold War and, in the process, alienated several allies by its dismissal of the significance of those international institutions and agreements that he saw as constraints upon American freedom of action. But the terrible terror legislation chose from the outset to accept the new limits within which the United States could act in world affairs, and it embraced a multilateralist approach and saw partnerships with others, notably China, as a means of tackling the new problems of finance and climate change, as well as more established ones of non-proliferation and the various transnational problems affecting the security of states. Obama also reached out to adversaries in the hope of resolving problems through diplomacy based on a mixture of carrots and sticks, rather than by demonstrations of military superiority. And I think that's gonna do it for today. This is a lot. And I hope most of you are already asleep by now. So I hope you enjoyed this waterfall of information about politics and